our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That was the draft of the Declaration presented to Congress by the drafting committee, and with the exception of several changes made by John Adams and Ben Franklin, it was Thomas Jefferson's work.
Well, Jefferson later said that he borrowed from neither book nor pamphlet in composing the Declaration of Independence, but the letter in which he said this is rather ambiguous. It may be that the book he said he did not use was Locke's Second Treatise of Government, and the pamphlet was a pamphlet by James Otis of Massachusetts.
But without a doubt, ideas and phrases remembered from his past reading had made their way into his text.
Well, he had certain models, and certainly he had, in fact, an outline to work from if John Adams was correct. John Adams said that when the drafting committee first met, it discussed the Declaration, and indeed it divided it into articles, and then put its instructions down on a piece of paper for the draftsman that it appointed. In other words, Jefferson began with a piece of paper that told him how to organize the document. It is possible, in fact, that the committee told him, incorporate some language like George Mason's draft Declaration of Rights of Virginia. That document had appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette on June 12th, 1776, the day after the committee was appointed, and conceivably the first day it met. And you will recall that the Virginia Declaration of Rights had a very familiar sounding line that all men are born equally free and independent. We know that Jefferson also used a draft constitution for Virginia that he had drafted. Virginia only used the preamble, which was for all practical purposes a Declaration of Independence.
Undoubtedly, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was written under the influence of such treatises as the Magna Carta, the works of English philosopher and political theorist John Locke, thinkers of the Enlightenment, and of course, the English Declaration of Rights of 1689. It was the declaration which formally ended the reign of James II and inaugurated that of William and Mary. It provided a very appropriate model of how to proclaim the end of an old regime and the beginning of a new one. The old regime was not going out quietly, however. The war continued to rage.
As this was happening, the entire government of the United States, the legislative, the judicial, the executive, all of which was invested in the Continental Congress, sat down to debate independence and then spent 2 days editing the document the committee had submitted for its consideration.
The delegates left most of the opening paragraphs untouched, except Jefferson's inherent and unalienable rights became certain unalienable rights. More often, however, the delegates cut back or eliminated the most extreme and untenable assertions in the committee's draft. They also crossed out the phrase, "for the truth of which we pledge a faith yet unsullied by falsehood." So the paragraph ended simply, "To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." The adjustments the delegates made to the individual charges against the king were mostly moderations of Jefferson's claims. They did, however, entirely eliminate Jefferson's long passage accusing the king of trading in slaves. The contradiction was obvious. Many of the delegates themselves owned slaves, Jefferson included. Congress also shortened Jefferson's attack on the British people to a more lean and constrained statement. It also added 2 references to God, which were missing in Jefferson's draft. Americans held strong religious beliefs in 1776, and the Declaration of Independence was meant to state the convictions of the country's good people.
Jefferson wrote parts out on little pieces of paper and then integrated them into the manuscript as he presented to other members of the drafting committee. Then he pulled them all together in what is now known as the original rough draft, which is the most interesting, but in many ways the most elusive document. It is owned today by the Library of Congress, which puts it on display regularly. It was the draft as he submitted it to John Adams and to Benjamin Franklin, and there are changes on the original rough draft that are in Franklin's or in Adams's hand, and they are identified in the margin by Jefferson as Adams's or Franklin's.
The delegates made no change, however, to Jefferson's concluding memorable pledge of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
If you look at the Declaration of Independence as it was submitted by the committee, with all of Congress's editings marked in, one will very quickly notice something striking. And that is most of the editorial changes come in the final half of the document, and they're quite heavy editorial changes. They took out a lot. They even inserted new lines in the final paragraph. My theory is it gives us a clue as to how Jefferson wrote, and it's the same way many people write today. They will write the beginning, and then at the end where they stop for the day, that's fine. The next day they go over what they wrote before and then go on. So they build up momentum and write more. The net result is that the opening of any draft is much better written than the conclusion.
Congress' achievement was remarkable. In just a matter of days, the Declaration of Independence became a finished work, politically aligned with the convictions of the American people. Finally, on July 4th, the Committee of the Whole reported its work was done, and President John Hancock affixed his now famous signature. Since before the Battle of Lexington, the British Crown had placed a reward of £500 for John Hancock's arrest. As he signed the document in his bold script, Hancock said, "His Majesty can read my name without his glasses and can double the reward on my head." Congress ordered the Declaration to be authenticated and printed under the supervision of the drafting committee. It was copied by a fine penman on parchment. On Friday, August 2nd, 1776, the document was signed by all 56 delegates. The Declaration was proclaimed throughout the 13 colonies by readings before large groups of people in public places.
We have to think back to a period where there was no television, there was no radio, there were not media, there was a medium, which was the newspapers. And not even the newspapers covered the entire country. There was a distinct area within which newspapers circulated. But there were a lot of people that lived beyond those areas. I find this rather touching. In Massachusetts, the Declaration was read on the Sunday services in all the major congregations because that's where you could reach the people. In Virginia, it was on court days. General Washington, on orders from the Congress, had the Declaration read to the troops. And we have accounts of this in New York, where the troops were brought up in formation, the various officers read the Declaration. And the accounts say they could see off in the distance on Staten Island the British while the Declaration was being read.
The first anniversary of independence was celebrated in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1777. And it was announced that thus may the 4th of July, that glorious and ever memorable day, be celebrated through America by the sons of freedom, from age to age, till time shall be no more. Amen and amen.
Most historians, I think, and John Adams in the 18th century assumed that the celebration of independence would come on July 2nd. It was on July 2nd that the Continental Congress adopted the resolutions of Richard Henry Lee saying that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Instead, of course, we celebrate July 4th, which was the day the Congress issued the Declaration.
The Declaration of Independence was first of all a justification for the American Revolution, but with time became not only a powerful statement of national identity, but a moral standard by which the day-to-day policies and practices of the nation could be judged. It was the crowning achievement for Thomas Jefferson, who died, ironically, on the 4th of July, 1826. He personally wrote the inscription on his tombstone, and he identifies himself as the author of the Declaration of American Independence. Jefferson may object, however, to the way in which his document is quoted on the walls of his memorial in Washington, D.C.
The Jefferson Memorial includes two passages from the Declaration of Independence. The first is drawn, of course, from the second paragraph, but it's important to understand that the first sentence of the second paragraph was very long and very thoughtfully and skillfully constructed by Thomas Jefferson. It included several phrases piled one on another in succession. And it went on through the greater part of the paragraph and ends with the assertion of a right, which was very relevant to the situation in 1776, the right of revolution. Everything led up to that. It was the climax. It was the point of the sentence. The passage on the Jefferson Memorial chops the sentence off in the middle. So it has the familiar opening about we hold these truths to be self-evident. It asserts equality, it asserts inalienable rights. It asserts, too, that governments are formed to protect these rights. There it ends. If it ends there, it changes the whole meaning of the sentence. It becomes equivalent to a Bill of Rights. The Jefferson Memorial